Hi, I want to welcome you tonight. This is Social Stratification, and I want to welcome you tonight. This is June 5th, 2020. It is Breonna Taylor's 27th birthday, and she was killed a few days ago as an EMT sleeping at home in her house in her bed with her boyfriend when the police broke through on a no-knock warrant. There are other things going on. This afternoon, there was a demonstration outside my front door in the city of Philadelphia. And I want to talk to you a little about, we're talking about social stratification. We're talking about social stratification by race. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the history of police abuse of power in the United States. And let me preface that by saying that I know a goodly number of you may be becoming law enforcement officers, may be becoming disaster preparedness and emergency management people. Part of, sociology is this broad look at things, and even in the criminal justice department, there is an assessment of an analysis, sociological analysis of how things go within any given institution or body. So we're starting this by saying that there are definitively good police officers. I also want to start by mentioning the book by Gary Haugen, H-A-U-G-E-N, who writes a book called The Locust Effect in 2014, published by Oxford University Press, in which he discusses how very important it is for a society, a Western society, or a developed society to have a good policing system. And he describes developing countries in which there is not a good policing system and the kinds of abuses and horrors that can happen when there is not an actual criminal justice system in place. But on that ground, a criminal justice system needs to be equitable. It needs to address all people groups within a society from a position of equity and fairness, and police need to be restrained in their use of power. So I want to just go back a little bit in time and give us a little bit of a historic overview, and everything I'm going to address could absolutely be delved into for hours and hours, for weeks and weeks of coursework, could become a dissertation of its own, could become someone's life work, any part of this, and has been. But I do want to talk about the history of policing in the United States. So in the United States, as the Europeans, air quotes, settled this nation, this landmass, and made it into what has become our nation, the United States of America. There is initially not any sort of police force. There is a social contract in which people are agreeing to get along, to do certain things in certain ways. And so there's a fabric to society that is, generally speaking, at some level working, at least for those who were initially franchised by our Constitution, on the recognition that our Constitution was written only to enfranchise white men who owned property, not women of any color, not men of any color who were not property owners, not men of color, not incoming immigrants later. It was just initially written with that idea in mind. And so in this history, there's not a police force initially. We start to get, and there may be pieces of this that I'm missing, but we start to get a particular kind of police force. And I'm turning this just a little because that lamp is bothering the picture. We start to get a particular kind of police force in the South under slavery. So one of the things that happens with slavery, and in my research, there is a time and a place. It appears that there can be an argument that there was a time and a place before there was a color line, before there was color as a use of designation of worth or non-worth, or hierarchically. But what begins to happen as we get the rise of capitalism and the rise of nation states, and there becomes this need in early capitalism for a free or nearly underpaid labor force. And so in the early Americas, in the colonial America, in the East Coast of the United States, under what are largely the first British immigrants and who have settled, quote, settled here, it begins to be apparent that if someone has working for them an indentured Caucasian someone Irish, someone whatever, someone from somewhere in Europe who has come in, who has sold their rights for 5 or 7 years to be a laborer in order to pay for their passage, and whatever's going on with them, that they've become indentured. The indentured servant, one, is supposed to be set free at some point after you've invested a lot into their time and training. The other thing, and whether that always happened or not is not the point. The other thing is that if the indentured servant decides to run away, the indentured servant is hard to find. If I'm in Richmond, Virginia, if I'm in a small town in Virginia and I am a white indentured servant and I see my chance to make a run for it, once I escape from my quote master, I'm able to get away, to disappear into the crowd of those who are considered to be freeborn and entitled to rights and privileges. Whereas so it becomes apparent early in Virginia history that color becomes a very handy way of distinguishing between unpaid and underpaid servants, so that if someone is brought here as a slave and then at some point takes their chance and runs, it is easier to try to recapture people of color than it is to try to recapture the white person. There's less of that ability to disappear into the crowd. So very early on, there comes into play in early slavery in the South and the colonial America, there comes into play this setting in which if you are Black, whether you're freeborn or whether you are slave-born, you must have papers on you at all time to designate whether or not you are allowed to be where you are. So if you are off of the plantation, or if you're freeborn and living, minding your own business, at any white man's request, you must produce documentation. So if you're freeborn, you always show that. If you are born enslaved, then you are producing a pass that is from your master. There's a blockage to allowing slaves to learn to read and write. So the presumption is you cannot have written your own papers. And so if you show a document that is written in understandable English and signed by some name that could be your slave master, then it is your permission ticket to go from one plantation to another, perhaps to do the work of a blacksmith or something. So there's this early control mechanism. What then happens with that is that there has always been African-American resistance. African-Americans were never docile slaves, not that no individual was ever not cowed down, or that there were no individuals who were ever cowed down, but there was constant ongoing insurrection, constant ongoing ways in which both males and females fought back against that system and resisted and ran and did what they needed to do. And so very early on, they institute something that becomes known as the paddy roller system, in which every white man, whether this white male is a slave-owning white male or whether he's even very, very poor and not slave-owning, no matter his social status, he must, after a certain age, every white male must patrol the woods. At certain points of time, there's designated times in which you must patrol the woods looking for runaways, for whomever. So if a particular runaway, event happens, then you might be looking for a particular individual, but there's a constant policing of the woods, looking for those who might be escaped and be traveling north to freedom. And so that grows and becomes a system that's firmly entrenched. And if you study anything about or know anything about the history of the Underground Railroad, it is a space in which flight from place to place to place is definitely fraught. If you are the slave running away, you don't necessarily know which Quaker house to go to next, or which other, Episcopalian is going to be an abolitionist, or where it is to go to a safe house. And there are some symbols and there are some ways, but a lot of people simply ran away, just taking their chances and just doing their best. And so, knowledge was shared about, how to tell which way was north and how to stay in the river and try to stay away from the hound dogs. But this in the running, there's a lot of just taking your own life in your hands and doing your best to make it to freedom. And so this paddy roller system exists. And without going into great detail, the Civil War is then fought. An interesting thing, an aside about the Emancipation Proclamation, is that Abraham Lincoln declares the slaves in the southern states, in the Confederate states, emancipated. But when he does that, he does not emancipate anyone who's still who in a border state. He doesn't emancipate the people in Delaware, Maryland. He's not emancipating. Don't hold me to the Maryland, but he's not doing that. He is declaring as president of the Union that, and he was, elected president of the United States, but he's declared, the Southerners have declared themselves no longer part of the United States. They've declared themselves a separate nation. They've declared themselves to have a separate president and a separate constitution and a separate flag. And so he's sitting in one place in Washington, D.C., declaring somebody else's slaves free. And they're like, you're not the boss of me. You're not my president. And so it, did not actually emancipate anyone at that point. I read just a few minutes ago that Governor Wolf of Pennsylvania declared June 19th, a Pennsylvania state holiday as of this year and going forward. It has, of course, been celebrated by African Americans since the end of the Civil War, since the Civil War ends in 1865, but it's not until June 19th that many slaves in the deep South in places like Texas find out that the Civil War happened and that they're supposed to have been freed and all of that. So Juneteenth is a particular holiday event of that. But so in that space, slaves are declared free. Many leave, some don't know where to go, many stay. That's a whole other conversation. But what then happens is the Northern troops occupy the South for a number of years, about slightly short of a decade, and forget if it's 9 years or 11 years, but right in that window of time, about a decade, they occupy the South in what's called Reconstruction. And during that time, because Northern troops are enforcing this freedom, there's a lot of things that happen. There are a lot of freeman schools that are raised up by African Americans, teaching their children, and others coming in and helping teach, and just a real push toward education and toward learning to read and write that have been denied. But there is also in that space, there are a lot of men, because at this point women have no rights of any, women of any color have no rights. But Black men begin to become state representatives and state senators and become, authorities in various local places, win elections, run for office. And so there's this window of time in which there's some forward motion. There's a window of time in which there's Black home ownership beginning to take place and Black towns growing up and Black businesses. And so there's this something happening under Reconstruction. We reach the end of what we call Reconstruction, and the North calls for its troops that are stationed in the South and sends them out west to end the, air quotes, Indian Wars. So they are sent out to become cavalry and finish the genocide of Indigenous Americans. And so as that happens, the South immediately, state by state, begins to pass what become known as Jim Crow laws that enforce a rigid racial segregation. And with that shift, there is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And so this group begins to form. It comes out of, a lot of it comes out of those patty rollers who just a few years before had been patrolling the woods. They have their racial ideology that is all based on color, and they are going to reinforce that. And the Klan rises to be an enormous organization all across the United States. There is also at that point in time, so if you think of the West at that moment, as the West is being settled, air quotes settled, as it's being invaded by Europeans, and the rest of the Indians are being moved to reservations or being killed off in other ways, and there's deeper conversations to be had there. There is some early local sheriffs and deputizing of sheriffs and deputizing of posses, and of course that cavalry we talked about. So these are sort of early ways in which, quote, laws begin to be enforced in the United States upon those who don't, who aren't part of the social contract. What rises then out of this window of time? So we're in the late 1800s, the Civil War ends in 65, you know, by the 1880s and 90s, we have the Klan. We have this history of lynching. So lynching is quite, it's not simply hanging. Lynching is extrajudicial killing. So when someone is lynched or has been lynched, they are killed without benefit of arrest or, trial by judge and jury. So without the criminal process being, the procedures being carried out, it's extrajudicial. It's someone taking it into their own hands. So by rights, the death of Ahmaud Arbery can be classed as a lynching because even though the two men who shot him, and we will see what happens with the third man who was following with his camera, but even though the men who killed him were not at that point, were not police officers, and so they're not killing in the name of the state. Even if someone is a self-appointed vigilante, like the murderer of Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman was simply a appointed neighborhood watch character who was following this teenage boy home because he didn't like the fact he was inside this gated community. Of course, he was inside the gated community because his father lived inside the gated community, and he had simply walked to the convenience store for, Arizona iced tea and Skittles. And then, later there was all this news, like apparently you can make drugs out of Arizona iced tea and Skittles. But, he simply was a teenage boy who went to the convenience store for candy and a drink. And he was being followed by a self-appointed vigilante who then got out of his car after the police that he called told him to not bother this boy. He got out and shot him. So this is a lynching. It's a lynching because it's extrajudicial. He has not been tried, found guilty of a crime worthy of death and convicted and given a death sentence conviction, right? A sentence of a death sentence. That's not what's happened here. And so the death of Ahmaud Arbery is a lynching. So also is the death of George Floyd, because he's being executed so he was arrested in the sense that he was handcuffed while he was being knelt on, while there's one officer on his neck and another on his back, on his spine, another on his thighs. He's being crushed to death so that he can't breathe. And he's saying that, and they're not listening, so they're continuing to carry it forward. But it is lynching in the fact that if he had done something wrong, like you or I, we could pass, so it's supposed to have been a counterfeit 20, or there was a question about whether it was a counterfeit 20. You or I could pass a counterfeit bill anytime. We could get change and someone give us one and we didn't know it and they didn't know it. And, whatever, like at that point, if we get busted passing a counterfeit bill, then, the police would have every right to get a search warrant and come search our residence and make sure we're not printing money ourselves. And then that should be the end of it, right? So if they felt there was cause for whatever reason to arrest him, then you restrain. The police should be able to arrest and restrain someone who is thought to be guilty of a crime, right? So whatever this question was, fine. You handcuff someone, you restrain them. The video footage does not show George Floyd resisting arrest. I don't know if he said something to a police officer while in the backseat of the cruiser, because at one point he was in the backseat of the cruiser and then he's pulled back out. Don't know what he said with his mouth, but his body was physically restrained. And that's where the police officer's duty ends, other than booking down at the station, right? Transport and booking. And then what should happen is then there should be a hearing, there should be a judge, there should be a trial, there should be whatever the next steps are in a process, depending on what crime the person's being accused of. And that's what should happen, not death by cop on the street or by vigilante on the street. So what happens at this place is, so with the Klan, there's a lot of lynching, and we end up with somewhere on the average of about 150 lynchings per year in the United States from the end of Reconstruction heavily through into the 1930s. Anti-lynching advocates like Ida B. Wells dedicated an entire lifetime to fighting lynching, began to try to have an anti-lynching act passed by the US Congress just yesterday, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Kamala Harris, arguing for the passage of the House of Representatives, passed completely bipartisan, passed in the Anti-Lynching Act that we have not gotten in all of these years. We've been trying to pass it. They have been trying to pass it for 100 years approximately. And finally it passes the House. We also have an issue with a few other things like the Equal Rights Amendment for women, but this Anti-Lynching Act has been stalled and ignored and stalled and not passed and passed over and over again, a decade after decade after decade. It finally passes the House with bipartisan consent, and all of the senators are ready, 99 senators are ready to vote on this anti-lynching bill when Rand Paul stood up yesterday and resisted it on whatever his grounds were. And then there's an impassioned speech by Booker and by Harris, who are both people of color, about the importance of this Anti-Lynching Act. It reminds me also of the Hate Crimes Act. In 1998, I believe, the fall of it, 98, 98. There were two murders in that summer fall. There was the murder of a gay white boy by the man at the University of Wyoming, Laramie, named Matthew Shepard. And Matthew Shepard was killed for being gay. And he was horribly pistol whipped or beaten with the butt of a gun of some sort, left propped up against a prairie fence. They say the only part of him, trigger warning, but they say the only part of him that wasn't covered with blood was where his tears had run down. By the time he was found, probably 30 some hours after the beating, he was essentially comatose. He was transported to the hospital. He was diagnosed as brain dead, put on life support. His parents had to be brought in and unplug him. And so Matthew Shepard died. The country responded, the nation responded, then President Bill Clinton responded, many celebrities responded. There were candlelight vigils all over the nation for the death of Matthew Shepard. That same window of time, that same late summer, early fall, there was the murder of a man by the name of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas. James Byrd was walking home. Somehow, we don't know, in the case of Matthew Shepard, we don't know how he ended up in the truck of his assailants, except that we do know he met them at a bar in Laramie, and probably not a gay bar, because I don't think Laramie, Wyoming had a gay bar, but James Byrd Jr. was walking home. He ends up in the back of the truck of some white guys, and three of them, if I remember correctly. They end up at some point, and again, trigger warning, because they brutally murdered him. They pull his pants down, which is something I had seen a display on the history of torture through the ages done by the American Civil Liberties Union on Presentation in Atlantic City some years ago. And in there, as you went from exhibit to exhibit in the ways people have done this to each other across time, the statement, it was clearly identified that overwhelmingly women were sexually tortured when they were tortured, but that overwhelmingly males were not, except when the male is a male of color. And so there is a history in lynching in the United States of sexually humiliating or torturing men, Black men, as they were killed, sometimes Latino men. And so his pants were pulled down. He was chained by a piece of chain link, metal link chain, to the back of a pickup truck and dragged in a zigzag pattern that threw him side to side until and the evidence forensically was that he was alive through the dragging, that he was making movements to try to spare his spine and his head where the flesh was being torn off, and that at some point he was flung off to the side of the road and his head and one shoulder were decapitated, and he was then dumped on the steps of a Black church. And so both of those hate crime murders happened that particular summer and fall. And the Black movements and gay movements began to fight for a federal hate crimes amendment. And part of the argument in regard to a hate crimes amendment was that a hate crime is a particular kind of crime, in that a hate crime speaks to the entire people group. So the question was being asked, well, there are laws on the books against murder. clearly these two men were murdered, and so their killers can be tried for murder. Why do you need something bigger than simply murder to charge them with? And the answer was that when Matthew Shepard was killed and when James Byrd Jr. was killed, which appeared to be a random act of violence, that in the killing of each of them, what was being done was a statement was being made to the entire communities that they represented. And clearly you can see this with the murder of George Floyd and with Ahmaud Arbery. With Breonna Taylor, it's a different story. We'll get to that no-knock warrant issue in a minute, but there's, in these two particular killings, there is a statement being made to all Black people in the United States that you are not safe, you're not welcome, you're not this, you're not whatever that is, that you are worthy of being killed at random for no particular reason, for something trivial, right? Even if he did pass a counterfeit 20 knowingly, it's not a death sentence crime, right? And it's highly likely, it's really likely the bill wasn't counterfeit, and it's also really likely that he didn't know it if it was, whatever. So in that space, there is the push for a Hate Crimes Act. It takes about a decade before that Hate Crimes Act is finally passed. There is a federal hate crime statute, which I believe should be enacted, especially in both of these cases. And that federal hate crime statute is written to say that when someone is killed for their status within a particular embodied category, if you're killed for being Jewish, or you're killed for being Black, or you're killed for being gay, or you're killed for, being Muslim, or you're killed for whatever, being an immigrant, that is because it is being done because of your characterization in that intersection, that embodied intersection, that it is therefore bigger than just the individual. It is speaking to your entire community, and therefore there should be these extra levels of punishment attached to the commission of hate crimes. So we did finally get that passage. No one has mentioned it in regard to this at this moment in my hearing. But the Klan enacts hate crimes, and lynchings are hate crimes. And so 150 of them on average are happening a year around the nation. We don't get an anti-lynching law, but the anti-lynching activists do manage. Something shifts as we hit the 1930s, and perhaps it is the effect of vast economic depression, and people are more worried about eating than lynching at that point in time, or perhaps the statistics simply get more blurry, at least in my knowledge at that point in time. Maybe it's World War II and the other things are on people's minds, but there appears to be a dip at that point in time. And lynchings did happen north, south, east, and west. They happened everywhere around the country in those decades. But it appears to have slowed some. But in the 1950s, in early 1950s, we have the murder of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old Black boy from Chicago. His family and his mother's family, the people were from Money, Mississippi. His mother was a single mom. She sent him back to spend the summer in the rural area with his uncle. So he was sent down to Money, Mississippi, and he was there with his cousins at his uncle's house. And they walked into a white-owned store. The story the woman told was that he whistled at her. Emmett Till's mother said that Emmett had a bit of a stutter, and she had taught him when he would get stuck on his words to whistle to try to get his words out. It's unclear what exactly happens in this moment between this 14-year-old boy and this woman that I think would have been in her early 20s. I hadn't looked up her age lately, but she wasn't old. And but her husband, and his brother get involved. A few nights later, they come to Emmett Till's uncle's house, and they rip Emmett Till out of his bed, and they take him out. And again, trigger warning, they do many things. They beat him mercilessly. They also beat him badly enough that one of his eyes is knocked out of its socket. And they also shoot him. And then they take a wire and they tie a cotton gin fan to him, which is an enormous piece of metal. And they sink him in the Tallahatchie River. And so, his uncle is, tells his mama what happened to him, whatever. There are police brought in to look for him. It takes some time. He is found in the river. The two men are put on trial. Their wives sit lovingly by their sides. Through the whole trial, they are found not guilty. And his mother asked for an open casket, even though he's been horribly disfigured both by what they did to him and by the amount of time he spent in the river. And so there's a glass covered coffin, and she asked that the pictures of how he actually looks in that coffin be published in Ebony magazine, and it goes around the nation, and it has the kind of effect that watching George Floyd be compressed to death. I mean, if you kneel on the side of someone's neck, what are you actually doing to their neck? But it had that kind of powerful effect on the conscience of the nation. And there's something of a shift in that moment of time. I'm going to rewind. So we're holding the Emmett Till moment. There is another moment. There's another thing that happens in those intervening decades. After Reconstruction is over, those Southern plantation owners, they can't recover the Southern economy without cotton. The North is dependent on cotton. It's dependent on cotton for the manufacture of textiles and a lot of Northern underpaid slave labor, not really slave labor, but nearly slave labor, that of the sweatshop workers and the seamstresses in that industry is all built around Southern cotton. And so there's this demand for Southern cotton, and they are trying to rebuild themselves economically after their demise in the Civil War. And so what begins to happen is they pass, along with the Jim Crow laws, a number of laws that are sometimes called pig laws. It's like, you stole my pig, you get arrested. And so there's this something that happens where Black men begin to be arrested on the accusation of any white man, including just the sheriff for the heck of it, and begin to be arrested and imprisoned. And so this system is called peonage. And this person you become arrested for some very trivial, perhaps not an offense that may not even have happened, but you get arrested on some very trivial charge, and then you are commanded to go to prison, usually with an indeterminate sentence. And so there's no definite date you're getting out. And those men were then sent to work in mines. They were sent to work the fields, the cotton fields. They were sent to work those fields on chain gangs under rifle guard so that they couldn't run away. And so there's this whole system of what they called convict leasing that arises. And they essentially replace the workforce that they lost when they lost slaves. So in losing the labor of slaves, the Southern landowners and plantation owners replace that by this system that goes into place, falsely accusing and arresting and imprisoning Black men and turning them into convicts. And convicts were actually cheaper than slaves, in the sense that you didn't have to purchase them in the first place, and you didn't have any real investment in them. So if they simply died while working in your mine or your field, it was no big deal, because there was this endless supply to just go rent someone else to fill their shoes. And so there was a really high death rate for those convicts. That then feeds into a moment in time when there is a legal ruling and a judgment that peonage is wrong, that it's unconstitutional, that it has to stop. And so convict leasing and the peonage system is stopped. And so we've got this moment. We're in the 1950s. Convict leasing has been brought to a halt. Most lynching has stopped, and the murder of Emmett Till is viewed with horror. Brown versus Board of Education happens. The NAACP had been founded, I believe, 1909 by a group of Black and white lawyers who volunteered their time, and they began to look for cases that they could argue up through, as when they would lose at the local level, then argue it at the state, and then at the federal, and if necessary at the Supreme Court. So they were looking for those good cases. Within the gay rights movement, Lambda Legal has fulfilled the same sort of role. The ACLU has sometimes fulfilled that role in many spaces. I think it would have been the ACLU within the labor movement. So you have the NAACP, founded in 1909, looking for cases to bring to the Supreme Court. Finally, in 1954, they get a Supreme Court ruling against segregated schools. And in that, so Brown versus Board of Education legally strikes down the segregation of schools, strikes down this, quote, separate but equal educational system where white students had good schools and good school buses and whatever kind of tools and equipment, lots of books and pencils and chalk, and Black students were sitting in one room shacks with a piece of slate if they were lucky. And so that all happens in the mid-50s. And with that, there's this this coming to the fore of the civil rights movement. So you have a civil rights movement happening all this time from the very end of slavery. So under slavery, there was Black resistance. Immediately after slavery, there's Black social justice movement, right? There's from abolition, we go straight into fighting to desegregate things. We have Frederick Douglass, who had been a runaway slave and an abolitionist, who managed to, he was fighting to get, I think it was Boston, but to get the public transportation system integrated. There were no people of color allowed to ride on the trains or the horse-drawn trolley things. And so he managed to get it so that there was a Black car attached, a Negro car attached to the train. So at least you could ride, right? Public transportation. Sojourner Truth, who was a first wave feminist and a abolitionist and an itinerant preacher, she is one of 3 women I'm aware of in history who claim to have been led by hearing the voice of God. That would include Joan of Arc, who has, been canonized. It would, by the Catholic Church, it would include Harriet Tubman, if anyone did see the movie Harriet that was just out recently. If not, I highly recommend it. There are issues, and we can talk about, I guess in private conversation, since we're Zooming, we can talk about, the white savior thing and whether that's what happened in that film or not. The Black filmmaker does not believe that happened or that she intended that, but whatever. It's still a movie in which Harriet Tubman is shown with in her spirituality and her depth as somebody how she felt led. Both Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, to my knowledge, did not know how to read, and I don't know whether Joan of Arc did, but those 3 women. But Sojourner Truth and her being led by what she believed to be the voice of God, began to try, I think it was Washington, D.C., to integrate the public horse-drawn trolley and to get on the trolley and was, put off by the trolley owner. So the whole thing that happens with Rosa Parks was happening for decades, literally for decades, before that moment when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. And Rosa Parks wasn't just tired. Rosa Parks was part of the local NAACP, and they were looking for a case. They were looking for the arrest. There had been a teenage girl, Claudette Colvin, who had been arrested a short time before Rosa Parks, but she was determined not to be the proper poster child for the movement for desegregation of public busing or public transportation because she was pregnant out of wedlock, whereas Rosa Parks was married, she wasn't pregnant, she wasn't middle-aged, but she was established, and so she was the perfect poster child. There were women that were already ready, and the minute that her arrest became public, immediately they went and they printed on transparencies, the mimeograph, they printed all of these notices calling for the bus boycott, and so all of that was ready to go. This was a plan to break down segregation in the public transportation system, but Sojourner Truth had been part of it. That there was a woman in Philadelphia. So part of the protest this week, there was talk in Philly about the peaceful protest that happened by the statue of Octavius Cato at the south side of City Hall. I actually haven't seen that statue. It's only been up, I think, since 2017, but anyway, Octavius Cato was fighting he was a teacher in what they called a colored school then. I forget if it was also called a normal school. There were those weird names they had for schools in the 1800s, the early 1900s, but he was a teacher, and he was in basically a freedom school in Philadelphia. His fiance also was part of that school, was one of the teachers in that school. She tried to integrate the public transportation. They managed to take it and to sue and to win a court case. And then she was kicked off a bus after that. And then she went back with the document from the court, and they had to let her ride. He was shot for voting. So they're just or shot on election day, something with Abraham Lincoln. So look that up. But so in this space, there is this. There's just a long fight for desegregation of public transportation. John Lewis, who is still in the US House of Representatives, was burned, was twice on a bus that was firebombed as part of the Freedom Rides to desegregate interstate bus transportation. So we have living people who were still part of that fight. But in the mid-50s, those parts of the civil rights movement come to public awareness, come to media attention. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s parents were involved in the movement, raised him aware of social and political issues, and then he comes in and he becomes a figurehead, but it's a movement that is literally millions of people strong and has been going for decades and continues through the 50s and through the 60s. And so there's this whole something. What happens then? So in the window of the 50s and the 60s with the social justice movements and the success of the civil rights movement and the respect that people of color are beginning to be given in the military, there's just certain doors that are beginning to open in American society. And so there's no peonage going on, and there's not this free labor source going on. And so what begins to happen, one of the things that's being critiqued in the civil rights movement era is police abuse of power or the excessive use of force. So there's this conversation about police brutality that is going on. Some of it that happens in Philadelphia happens in regard to the MOVE members who were part of a Black liberation group. In 1978, their house in Powelton Village was attacked by the police. In 1985, their house out further west into Philadelphia at Osage Avenue they dropped I believe the first Black mayor, Mayor Wilson Goode, was there as part of this, but the Philadelphia police and mayor and whatever, the hierarchy dropped a military grade weapon on their roof and burnt that house to the ground, killing the men, women, and children that were in that house, and with the exception of one or two, and burnt down maybe more than one block of Osage Avenue. And so actually we're at some anniversary of it this May, and Mayor Goode was going to make a public statement, perhaps he did, about how sorry he was about his role in that. But all of that, this abuse, this excessive use of force. And what begins to happen is Nixon comes in the 70s, or is there in the late 60s, early 70s, that moment of time when he's president. And then he begins to talk a little bit about drugs, and but they're not really a problem yet at this point. And then Reagan picks that mantra up again in 1980 when he wins the Republican nomination and wins the presidency in 1980. And both Nixon and Reagan begin to use this reframed conversation that goes from talking about Black people as evil and to be oppressed, and they begin to talk in code, and that code is law and order. That code is about a war on drugs. That code, so it becomes known as the Southern policy, to be tough on crime, to talk about, for politicians to argue that they're tough on crime, and this hyperventilating about drugs. Now, there's some drugs that will ruin your body, ruin your health, and own you, and you will not be free, right? I mean, there are some drugs you should not take. Do not believe in prohibition. Prohibition has never done any good. When we prohibited alcohol, we had an enormous amount of violence and gang violence, a lot of it Italian and Irish, around alcohol during prohibition. And so when you prohibit a substance, the price of it goes up, people war about their territory. All of the kind of violent crime that has been attached to drugs is there because the drugs are illegal. I do not believe the state should legalize drugs that ruin you, methamphetamine, heroin, they'll destroy you, right? I don't believe that they should be legal, but if someone is addicted to those, it's a medical issue. It's not, and so if we decriminalized and ended prohibition, we could then treat the situation properly. But instead, they declared a war on drugs, on substances, right, on substance abuse. And in the doing of that, we have since the 1980s, the early 80s, we have had this ongoing war on Black neighborhoods. White people use drugs and white people sell drugs in equal numbers with people of any other racial or ethnic group. Absolutely. College students use drugs, sell drugs. Let's be real, okay? And so in that whole war, it has been a war on neighborhoods. In the white neighborhoods I've lived in general, the police are lying in wait for me in a speed trap, and they're looking to give me a ticket. And the township may make a fair amount of money off of the fact that I was exceeding the speed limit, and they busted me for it. And so I get stopped, and I give them my driver's license, and I sigh, and they give me a ticket. And sometimes it's been enough money that, and I haven't had a deal yet, but sometimes it was enough that I was poor enough that like $162 was a real hit back in 1988, 90, whatever that was. So, and I went to traffic court because the cop, as he handed me my ticket, he winked at me and said, not in a flirtatious way, but in a sort of, like he said, listen, if you don't want these points on your license, I don't think I was crying, but if you don't want these points on your license, if you show up in court, if you contest it and you go to court on that day, I will say that you should have the points dropped. And so I went to court that day. I saw him and the prosecutor in the hallway. They agreed. I went and sat in the courtroom. At some point, the judge called. This was Linwood, New Jersey, which is Atlantic County and pretty close to the shore, near on Route 9, near, along in there, if anybody knows it. And so I got, the judge said, okay, who is here to have their points removed from, because of their tickets? And almost the entire courtroom stood. And within about 15, 20 minutes, that judge had cleared that courtroom out, one after the other. He'd stand, he'd say, do you plead guilty? You had to plead guilty. Do you plead guilty? You pled guilty. He looked at the cop, he looked at the prosecutor, they nodded in agreement. He pounded the gavel, you went out, you paid the $162, but you had no points on your license, right? So that was like I felt like it was a little racket. The only people left in the courtroom by the time I left were the people who had DUIs or who parked in a handicap spot. Everybody else was simply dismissed. So that's the one way. But if you've been in Black neighborhoods, it's more like they're policing whose hand touches whose hand, and did you pass money and a packet of something in that space. So there's been this something, and what it has done is it has produced something that is mass incarceration. It has reinstated that peonage system, and our incarcerated individuals in this country are used for labor. They're used by corporations. They make things, they manufacture, they get paid next to nothing. They get paid pennies for what they do. And this is peonage reinstated. And there's a couple of things going on here. So I highly recommend. Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. So I recommend her book, The New Jim Crow. It is this reinstatement of a new kind of slavery, a new kind of using free or next to free, nearly free labor. New Jim Crow, 2000. And she also I also highly recommend, if you'd rather watch something on YouTube, there's a YouTube video by her. I like the George E. Kent lecture she gave at the University of Chicago in 2013. If you YouTube into the search engine, Michelle Alexander, 2013, Kent lecture, University of Chicago, whatever, it will show up. Really, really excellent breakdown of exactly what's going on. She talks about the low-hanging fruit, how police departments have been encouraged to stop and frisk kids, right? To stop and look for small amounts of drugs, to bust people for minimal amounts of weed. And people are still, despite the effort to legalize marijuana, despite the medicinal marijuana laws, despite some states that have recreational marijuana laws, there's a whole lot of marijuana arrests still happening. Cory Booker, in his impassioned speech today, talked about, he gave the number, and I forget what it was, of marijuana arrests that were still made in this last year. We're talking nonviolent offenses that shouldn't be offenses, because we shouldn't be trying to regulate substances in this way, you know? And so, because prohibition doesn't work. So she talks about the low-hanging fruit, how police departments have managed to make money off of this. They can take the possessions of someone especially deemed to be someone who sells drugs, right? So they can take your house, your car, your grandma's house sometimes. They can take your stuff. There's all sorts of violation of our 14th Amendment right to freedom from illegal search and seizure going on in all of these. Briefly, the no-knock warrant is all part of this war on drugs, war on the Black neighborhoods, just to be able to knock down someone's door, break in, and and just like you don't identifying yourself. And of course, the whole image is that you've got this terrible drug criminal who's going to have, some sort of weapons in there, and you wouldn't be safe as a police officer if you knocked, but it's happening in the middle of the night. It's happening. It's just, and as we saw, so Breonna Taylor, whose birthday would have been today, she had an ex-boyfriend who they actually already had in custody, who had some drug issues, or I don't know exactly how big or how small his use or his sale of drugs was. I don't really know anything much about her boyfriend, except that they already had him in custody. She was no longer dating with him. She had a different boyfriend. I don't know how long the breakup had, but she was 26 years old, going on 27, working as an emergency medical technician through the COVID-19 crisis as an essential worker, exposing herself to COVID to help people all of the time, and wanted to become a NICU nurse, right? And they broke into her house, and he thought someone was breaking and entering, and so he fired a shot, and they I think it was 23 bullets that were fired. 8 of them entered her body. Some of them entered the house next door, into the room where a 5-year-old was sleeping, and some went up into the ceiling. I mean, just, this is not how American citizens or civilians in America are supposed to be treated. Another part of this has been, in this time, from the 1980s, these are public policies, many of them federal policies. So a lot of police officers down on the ground are being commanded to do these things. They're being trained to do these things. They're buying into an ideology that, wants to fight the war on drugs. But at the upper levels, part of what's happened is, from Reagan on, there has been a push, especially by Republicans, but there's been a push but not only, to privatize many, many things. There was a push to privatize our gas works in Philadelphia a few years ago. I think it failed, but I'm not sure. There's been pushes around the world to privatize water systems, which are always incredibly horrible when it happens. As inefficient as we may sometimes think government is, when things go into the hands of private corporations, they are so much about the bottom line that average people end up needing a week's wages to be able to buy 1 day's worth of water, and then it doesn't happen. And then there's drinking from the polluted river. So this privatization, our prisons have been privatized across these decades since the 1980s, so that our prisons were sold into the hands of private prison corporations that list on the New York Stock Exchange. And in order to have that happen, governors of states have promised the private prison corporations, if you will put a prison in my state for the sake of employment, for my perhaps rural individuals who can't get a job, if you will. So I'm governor, this makes me look good. I brought in jobs. And so I got a company to open a private prison in my state. To get them to say yes, I have to promise them, and governors have done this, they promise them a 90-something% bed fill rate. So if I promise you that if you bring in a prison and you put in, I'm pulling the number out of the air, 4,000 beds, I will fill them at 95 or 98%. I don't know, nobody's committed these crimes yet with which I'm going to fill these prisons, right? So now again, I'm looking for low-hanging fruit. I'm looking for people to imprison in order to get that company to come, in order to have them make their profit. Now, as that's happening, what is also happening is it's our tax dollars that are paying to house the arrestees, right? So people have been arrested for probably little things. Maybe they've been incarcerated in ways they should have been let go. There was a judge in upstate Pennsylvania a handful of years ago who got in trouble because he got caught incarcerating teenagers in juvenile detention with indeterminate sentences. And so you could get caught spray painting a bridge, making graffiti on a bridge to put your name on it, and get busted and be 14 and be in there till you were 18. And you were no longer a juvenile, and that's when you'd get sprung. Something you should have gotten 4 days for, or 4 hours, or a week or two, those kinds of offenses, because what was happening, he was getting kickbacks as the judge, but the private prison was getting to fill its juvenile detention center, right? And so that whole thing, so your tax dollars go to pay to house a prisoner, to pay for their bed, to pay for their meals, to pay for their uniforms, to do whatever. They then get to work and make Nike money, and the private prison companies getting the tax dollars for them. The taxpayers getting impoverished by our taxes are not going where they could have gone. The state of California, once upon a time, was top in the country, in the nation, in education. It became toward the bottom in education and toward the top in prison, prisoners and prison beds. And so this entire system of privatized prisons is part of creating this issue. There's also been a revitalization of racial profiling. So in that place of the 50s and the 60s, the critique of police brutality also included a critique of profiling. That changed with the bombing. So, and there were a lot, actually, it had become not okay in the eyes of the public. And then the New Jersey State Troopers got in trouble in the 90s for racially profiling people going up and down 95, thinking that everybody who was Black or brown was running drugs from Florida to New York or New England. And so they had gotten in trouble for that. But then the planes flew into the World Trade Tower, and the public sentiment shifted, and it became perfectly fine to racially profile Muslims and Arabs and with that at airports. And so that racial profiling just got revitalized in that kind of way. Also, I want to mention, so there's been this militarization of the police. So one of the things we're seeing, I heard today on the news that at the time I had heard that 11 protesters have been killed in the past week, right? Presumably by state engendered violence, by police or National Guard. There's in the 1970s, in 1970, on May 4th, 1970, there was a legal, peaceful protest of largely white college students at Kent State University in Ohio. And they were protesting the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was being questioned. Initially, the protest started out at a handful. They rose to the place where there were literally hundreds of thousands of people protesting the war in Vietnam, filling city streets like we've seen in this week, filling college campuses with the protests. And so there are students protesting at Kent State in Ohio. The National Guard the Ohio State National Guard, was called in. And at one point in time, they begin to throw tear gas into the peacefully protesting college students. Understand it is a First Amendment to the Constitution right to peacefully protest and to address your government for a redress of grievances. It is guaranteed under the Constitution that you have the right to protest, and nothing in the Constitution puts limitations on it of time or place or whatever. So they were protesting on their college campus. The National Guard are firing tear gas at them. Then they begin to march up the side of a hill, and there's surviving film footage. You can find it on YouTube if you look up the shootings at Kent State. And there are survivors of that shooting testifying about it, but there's also footage of the event itself. They march up the side of some little hill. They turn and they drop into formation so that the front row of National Guardsmen are on their knees, so this the other row can fire over their heads, and they're on the incline so that they can fire over their heads. And they open fire into the crowd of 18 to 21, 22-year-old college students. And they killed 4. They also injured, they shot 13. And so just 10 days later, at Jackson State University in Mississippi, on May 15th, 1970, the city and state police opened fire on that college campus. The students there had been protesting a racially segregated bowling alley. It was not really legal to still be segregated in 1970. The integration was supposed to have been won, and the city and state police fired into the women's dormitory building at Jackson State, injuring 12 and killing 2. And if you were to go to Jackson State University today, that building's still standing there with the bullet holes in the bricks in the side of the building. But they shot through the walls, through the windows, and they injured 12 and killed 2 college students. And the ones they killed hadn't necessarily been at any of the protests. They were just in the dorm, women in the women's dorm. But what we have going on here, and we also had then, we had, in all of those protest movements, there was the sense, we knew J. Edgar Hoover, they knew J. Edgar Hoover hated the various protest movements. He was particularly afraid of women's liberation. And women's liberation at that time had something they called consciousness raising groups, where they would have, like, 6 women in the suburbs getting together, sharing coffee and talking about, their husband's ED, and talking about, how he never helped with the dishes and didn't help with the kids, and, talking about their lives and whether or not they were content. Well, every one of them was infiltrated. There was a Temple University professor that I had the honor of meeting 1 or 2 times, talking to at least once, but passing on Temple University's campus a number of times, by the name of John Raines. John Raines and his wife, Bonnie Raines. John was a professor of religion at Temple University, and another guy who was at Radnor, and about 8 people broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and they found, I believe it was 71. It was before Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, before Edward Snowden, before any of those things, but Snowden's now. But they broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and during a Muhammad Ali fight, I think it was Ali Frazier, but they broke in and they stole all of the files out of the FBI cabinets, and they put them into duffel bags, and they booked it out of there, and they made it to some hotel room, maybe in the middle of Pennsylvania somewhere, something, and they began going through the documents, and they began sending sections of them to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. The New York Times was threatened by the FBI not to publish them because the FBI realized they'd been ripped off. They began a nationwide manhunt for the people who had broken into the media office. So it was Media, Pennsylvania, and they found in those, but so these 8 people never got caught. John Raines died. I was at his funeral. I would say it was about 2 years ago now, but maybe a year and a half. But he was, so they never got caught. They came out about a year before his death, and the reporter who did publish their stuff, but they sent packets of what they found. They photocopied FBI files and sent them to the Washington Post, and Betty Metzger was the reporter, and she published them. You can also see there's a movie, I think it was Meryl Streep who played the owner of the Washington Post then, Catherine Graham, and yeah, but they were publishing the Pentagon Papers in the film. But this is before that. She also did this, and so they published the papers that they found from the FBI. And what they found, and one of the most interesting things they found in those documents, was the word COINTELPRO. And when they finally figured out what it meant, someone finally figured out it meant counterintelligence program. And so there was documentary evidence in the files they took that there were FBI agents in the women's consciousness raising groups in the Philadelphia suburbs, that there were FBI agents infiltrating Black organizations all over the country, including churches and community groups and ladies' auxiliaries, not just civil rights groups, but every kind of social group. Infiltrating labor groups, any kind of social movement, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so all of that was infiltrated. And there was often the sense there was a lot of looting in some of the riots that happened in the 60s. There were summers where things were burning, I think 65, 67, 68. You can Google all of that. But in those riots, some of it happened on what is now Cecil B. Moore Avenue that crosses Broad Street at Temple University, the edge of Temple University's campus. I think that might have been called Columbia Avenue then, but that street was being looted and whatever. There was proof, evidentiary proof, that some of the looting was started by undercover FBI agents that had infiltrated protest movements. So currently, whatever's going on, there are questions, and there are questions rising. And if you're listening to national public radio, if you're listening to public broadcasting news, if you're listening to news coming out of England, Europe, The Guardian, various news sources like that, you'll find that there are some indications there might be something other than just angry Black people looting right now. But there's this other piece that's happened since the basic end of the war in Iraq, and we can argue about how over it is, but in the basic end of the war in Iraq, there was a lot of extra military equipment. And as Eisenhower, there's a movie called Why We Fight. Let me highly recommend that documentary. And it opens with a statement, the goodbye statement being made by President Dwight Eisenhower as he's leaving office. And he makes the statement that essentially because the United States had invented the atom bomb, that because we had invented atomic weapons, that there would never be a time going forward when we would not be at war. And so he made the state, he talked about the military, industrial, academic complex, and he talked about how the United States would always need to be at war to try to be the top dog in the world, so to speak. And so that has clearly been enacted by every president, Republican or Democrat, in all of these decades since. Everybody has invaded something. Everybody has done, there's these things always going on. And we have an enormous munitions manufacturing industry. We have companies that, you know, they make weapons and they make more weapons and more weapons and more weapons. There has to be a use for those weapons. And so if you look at the police photos of the National Guard shooting on Kent State or the police at Jackson State in those shootings, they are wearing riot gear. They've got bayonets fixed on their rifles. They have some amount, sometimes often in those protests, they have an amount of face shields and body armor. There's something, but if you look at the way our average police officers look now when they're on protest movement duty, and if you really look at the way our National Guard look, if you just look at the way our SWAT teams and all of that, like this is hyper militarized equipment that's being worn. and being used. There's these enormous, I don't know what they're called, but like tanks with long noses that shoot. You watched what was happening when Michael Brown was murdered in, shot in the back in Ferguson, Missouri, a few years back. Just they kept lobbing tear gas into the peaceful protests. At the end of the day, when they decided it was curfew time, they were shooting the tear gas canisters through this long-nosed thing, and now these flashbang grenades. So they say the flashbang and the rubber bullets are less lethal, but a rubber bullet will take your eye out. A rubber bullet can pierce your body, a rubber bullet can kill. And also the flashbang grenades, they say in general, like just a Google search about them and their effect, the general idea is that if it explodes a few feet away from you, that it will temporarily deafen and blind you. But that if it explodes right next to you, it may burst your eardrums, permanently deafening you, and it may also permanently damage your retina, causing you permanent blindness. And also, if it gets on you, one thing I was reading said that the actual chemicals used in it are hotter than lava. And so you can end up with second-degree burns all over your body or over portions of your body from this very militarized equipment. But what is this ideology of treating American citizens exercising their constitutional right to protest? The constitutional right, in this case, to protest extrajudicial killings of people of color, sometimes for breathing, right? Or just for driving and having a broken taillight. If I began to list the stories of people who've been unarmed and killed by police over, the past 10 years that we've had, or the past number of years that we've been able to make cell phone footage of it, these things may have been, if we ask people of color, they have been going on all along, and perhaps lynching never really did take a break. It moved over into this space, but certainly we can see where it's at now. But with it, where it's at is also this treatment of American citizens as enemies, as enemy insurgents, as if we do not have the right to peacefully demonstrate, to protest, to be angry and demand change from a government that's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people. The whole point of the Second Amendment was that people should be able to bear arms so that the government could be changed if it needed to be. We came out of a revolution, and those people writing those First Amendments were saying that we would continue to have a right to address our government, to ask it for a redress of our grievances, to protest, that we'd have a right to freedom of speech, to freedom of the press, that we'd have a right to be able, that the government could not establish a religion nor deny the free exercise thereof. So this whole these rights that are there in those First Amendments to the Constitution are connected. And the right to bear arms is a part of that. And you can't take one with, like, you can't be pro Second Amendment but anti First Amendment. We have to be pro Constitution, pro all of the amendments. And so just, tonight, as you're digesting social stratification by race in the United States, from the place where it becomes really, really convenient to use color as a way to designate who you should look for in the woods at night and who you should demand papers from, who should have to prove to you that they have a right to be out and about. As we move from that, W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line the problem of the 20th century. It's the problem still. It's ongoing, this problem in the United States. And so Black parents have to talk to their children and try to tell them how to be as docile as possible in connection with figures of authority. Amber Ruffin on Seth Meyers, um, he's one of the late shows, but has been talking this week about her run-ins with police, you know, and one time she described just being so happy to be back. She's back visiting from Amsterdam. She's going to visit a friend, and she's skipping down an alley to go to her friend's door and knock on her friend, throw her arms around her friend, and go out to dinner and catch up. And a cop accuses her of running and is really violent and hostile. She describes another time when she's with a white guy and a white friend, and how very deferential the police officer is to the white friend. You know, when I'm stopped by the police today, I pull out my faculty ID card and my ordination card, along with my driver's license, and I say, "Hello, officer. I am Reverend Dr. Nadine Sullivan, and did I, did I do something?" But you know that space, it's very different. It's very, very different. Even so, we need good police officers. Again, Gary Haugen describes in The Locust Effect what it is like in a culture, in a country, in a setting where criminals can break and steal and take your stuff and do whatever, and there's no way to get it back, and there's no redress of grievances in that way, right? So we need to have a criminal justice system. We are a country of laws. Democracy is based on a social contract that no one, including those in the executive branch, that no one is against the law in this country, in this nation, in the way its constitution is set up. But also, that law restrains police officers to the actual functions that their duties are actually to apprehend, to arrest, to transport, to book, to incarcerate, and then to turn it over to a judge, to a hearing, to a trial, to something more. And so in all of that, and there are many other pieces of this to discuss, but in regard to social stratification in the United States today, in regard to race, we come out of a history of slavery, move into a system of peonage, and we have moved into a system of mass incarceration, not because Black people are more violent or more criminal than white people, though the evening news can make it look that way, and social media can make it look that way, and even some of the media images in our movies and our entertainment are playing on stereotypes, but they are stereotypes. They're not real. We are one race of beings. We are one species. We are the human race. Biologists know that there is nothing, the shape of my nose, the amount or lack of melanin in my skin, the texture of my hair says nothing more or less about my humanity than anyone else's humanity. Phenotypical differentiations actually run, if you do Ancestry or 23andMe, they run through, it's a matter of family trees. My ancestors back 70,000 years and more, somewhere back in time, we all came from Africa. My ancestors going back through the generations go back to northern climates where we couldn't go outside most of the year. And if we didn't have a lack of melanin, we would have died of rickets because we would have had no vitamin D. Whereas those whose families' trees lived in Africa longer needed to be, or they still do, needed to be protected from the burning hot sun at the tropics or south, at the equator and south of the equator, and therefore darker melanin, it's family trees, it's family genetics back through thousands and thousands and thousands of generations of our ancestry. That's all it is. Beneath this, we all have the same number of bones, we have the same cardiovascular system, we are Even genetic diseases, even Tay-Sachs or sickle cell are running in DNA lines of inheritance from family trees and connected to regions, but not connected to being, we are not subspecies. We are one species. And all of this needs to stop in this generation. We need to live up to our ideals of a nation of liberty and justice for all, but we don't have it. And this is part of the stratification of our society by race.